this Miro board is like growing enormously, and it's becoming more and more interesting. You will see later a lot of new figures, and also the older figures, the earlier figures being sort of expanded, repaired. It's actually taking over a lot of the work we're doing. In advance, we always thought like this is more like a theater, or actually Naumakia. That's how it's presented on the website. Naumakia, in the sense that, you're with us in the water and we're battling about, and the audience is safely on the ring. Well, that image still sort of fits, but we were always thinking like, yeah, we present the figures as almost like on a theater stage. Sense of costumes almost, and or like a commedia, and they were trying to define the figures, but we always thought like maybe we should like ourselves be the figures, and that's changed a bit because the presentations, the people that are doing the presentations do not fully identify with the figures they're showing, and these figures are sort of taking their own life, and it was never the idea to actually fit them so perfectly with each other. Because we've always like been studying the Grace Atlas from A.B. Warburg, where you get separate pages, and they're not really figures, but they look a lot like figures. And it would be a very interesting study, not just like from an art historical point of view, but more from an architect's point of view, was how do you actually organize images as a diagramming technique. And so sometimes you see axes, sometimes you see multiple axes, like in grids, sometimes you see no axes at all. It's just like clusters of images that all have like different sizes and scales and colors. And I think that's especially interesting if you look at A.B. Warburg's Builder Atlas. And I think we're doing something similar, except that we're adding the readings, and the readings are a sort of a disciplining effect. So, but it also becomes something different in the sense that with readings, when students do readings, they normally transfer them into an essay. So they use diagrams to organize their essays, and then they have a block of quotes that are sort of landmarks in their text that they know how to steer their writing while they're writing the essay. And that's now slightly different because these images are starting to intervene, and also because they're now on a map. It starts to like you can read it in multiple directions. You can read it like over the axes. You can read it diagonally. You can flip from one figure to another, and that makes it very new to us, and we never planned to use the Miro board. Hayri proposed it, I think, in the second week or something, and this thing took a whole life of its own. And for us, it's really interesting to see if we can sort of pick out very specific elements from the readings, and then construct them with images. And I think what's really important to say is that the relationship between text and image is not as we normally understand it, that you say, okay, there's a text with its own sort of continuous argument, and then it's illustrated by images. No, here it's like interspersed with images, so the images are like really in between those blocks of readings, and maybe the reverse as well. So we're sort of inventing this, and especially in the second half after Hayri's presentation, we'll be looking at the Miro board again, and you will see that how it sort of densifies and how it becomes more and more like a map, almost a world map. I think that's really something we hadn't planned, and something we're getting obsessed with more and more. Okay, it's almost 12:30, so even though it's a pretty horrible day, thinking of the Russian invasion, I just want to have everybody welcomed, and I'm so happy you're all like returning. It is quite special for us to do this seminar and see everybody like from. Juzar, our actor, is actually 10 hours away from me in Atlanta, and then there's on the other side we have Christo, who's again 3 hours away from us on the west side or so. That's a span of like 13, 14 hours. Just a mind-boggling idea. to just like think of this, how that can actually work. Okay, so what we're doing today is the jumping figure. So it's the third event, but it's actually the second figure. And the jumping figure is it sounds like it's directly related to sports and play, but it is almost as fundamental as the standing figure, especially when you say standing is groundless. So there's it really says, look, there's this figure, and this figure stands by itself, but I mean, since standing still has that notion of standing on a ground, on reason, right? In German, it's Grund, reason. So that says enough. Now we already in the standing lecture sort of removed that ground, and we made the figure refer to itself, as sort of a self-lifting figure, which is of course directly related to the notion of grace, and it became a chiastic figure. Now I think if we look at what is happening with the different presentations and the different discussions we had on cycles and on reprise and sort of these cyclical notions, that we see that the chiastic in itself is not strong enough. I mean, clearly it comes from rhetoric, but it is, I think what we are seeing is not just a doubling or an asymmetry, but actually sort of spinning. And we've talked a bit about this a few times, that the figure is not just like stuck in between two poles, like standing and movement, or all these these different poles that we've been discussing. But it's actually going back and forth. It's like a little machine, and we find this really interesting. We see these poles, and we see this figure flipping or alternating, almost like alternating current. And it sort of still self-stabilizes there. So, and I think in that sense, it makes the jumping figure very important, because what is it? Does it go from A to B via this arc of metaphor, or this arc of the messianic arc even in Christianity? Or is it this thing at the apex, that it sort of finds the apex on this vertical axis? And we'll see that with the jump, how that sort of ambiguity starts to function and create this figure. Now, what's really important is that this notion of the gap starts to become much clearer when we talk about jumping. So, of course, we talked about the gap a few times already, but it's especially with jumping that we see how this gap functions and how it is not. Because I think that's also important to say, it's not this sort of cosmic nothing, this sort of cosmic abyss that we know from Romanticism, that is the God before God from Schelling, this sort of, and every time you make a step, there's always this abyss underneath your feet. That's what we know from existentialism and from the work from Zizek. There's always this constant negation going on. I don't think that the gap is actually something of that order. It's I wouldn't say more friendly, it's just extremely serious, but it does allow for fun, or at least for joy. And I think you can see that from the examples we've been using, that there is this sense of joy while that gap is still. So there's a gap that allows us to, I wouldn't say exactly measure it in the metric sense, but there is measure to it. It's so you can have the tiniest gaps, and you can have larger gaps, and they really depend on how the figure evolves and how it deploys itself. So I gave two examples. Of course, I need to refer to sports. We've been doing this in different ways. Lionel Messi, for instance, with his free kick. I'm for sure we don't see a lot of like quoting from sports in theoretical seminars. But I think it's important to say that these curved shots that we know so well from Apollo, and again from this arc, that Leo Messi is sort of this artist of the curve, and it's really a curve that is a detour in space itself. It really finds this gap next to the wall, right? So it's it's quite another idea to say, okay, there's a gap, there's a space, but it's riddled with gaps, and we know that term like room. I've referred to this in the lectures. Not a room, it's not like a room as an object, but it's room in the sense of wiggle room, or in German Spielraum. And there we go again, it refers to spiel and play and spilling over. So we get that notion, and we see it in animals as well. We'll be referring to animals. I've been showing the dolphin, especially because it's about this non-fitting. We always see these movies of happy dolphins jumping next to a cruise ship. Well, that's exactly not what it is. This gap is really in the water and in the air. He's swimming where he can't breathe, and he's breathing where he can't fly. So that makes it rhythmic, but it's always a finding of the gap. The gap is not really there. It has to constantly create this figure and find the gap. I'm using these figures of Messi and the dolphin because I think this notion of not fitting is very important. So it actually says we don't fit in our environments, right? So this is and animals don't fit. I wouldn't say it's an extreme anti-Darwinism, but there is a notion of not fitting, and in that sense there is a struggle to actually find grace. That leads us to this beautiful little dialogue between Socrates and Pistius, which is recorded by Xenophon and his memorabilia, and it starts, and it's a beautiful Socratic dialogue. It's just like 10 lines or something, but it's typical for Socrates. It's what he call maietics. It's a sort of a obstratic way of finding a theme or finding an understanding. So first by asking what is tight, what is a thorax or a breastplate, when you, as a blacksmith, Pistius, when you actually start to make and hammer out a bronze thorax. Of course, with that sculpted, and don't forget, this is actually quite important because the thorax is that of the torso, and very much the sculpted torso. So we get to this notion of the chest, and then even in the chest, he finds this wiggle room, because he says, look, it's impossible to make a tight fit if you don't have a well-proportioned body. Well-proportioned in Greek is eurhythmia. And he says, how do you actually fit it on somebody who's ill-proportioned? And of course, most of the soldiers were ill-proportioned, and that's arrhythmia. So we see already this word, eurhythmia and arrhythmia, how they sort of, in the construction of Socrates, how he's trying to fit one on the other. So it's not an opposition. He's actually trying to bring them together, but he can only bring them together via this gap, this wiggle room that is then inside or between the thorax and the ill-proportioned body. Now, why is that important for us? Because the word eurhythmia or eurythmia later in Latin becomes very, very important in the theories of Vitruvius. I'm sure some of you know about the 6 principles. And how these lead to the so-called lead to the 3 attributes, firmitas, venustas, and utilitas. But these 6 principles actually are very complex. Some are pure Latin, some are still Greek, some are in between. So eurhythmia actually leads directly from Greek and Hellenic theories into Vitruvius's hands. We were like in the first century BC. So right, he's a contemporary of Cicero, and that makes this whole sort of construction of the 6 principles and how they lead to the 3 attributes very, very complex. And I'm comparing it. I'm actually using in my lecture. I'm using Eugen Petersen, who wrote beautifully about rhythm and rhythmos. How that is not exactly form. I mean, form normally in Greek theory would be schema. Rhythmos is not just movement. It's really movement that leads to form, but a certain type of form, a rhythmic form. And that's very important to understand. So if you bring that to what Vitruvius was saying, it is suddenly not about, it's not a set of a critical tool afterwards, after the design, but it's actually in the design itself, right? So of course we do, what do we know of Roman? I mean, there's no sketches, there's no discussion of how you proceed through design of buildings, but these 6 principles are actually design principles, and they form a little machinery because they have to process movement. Now I'm almost done here. I'm using the example of Claude Perrault, who was a great translator, by the way, in the 17th century of Vitruvius, and how he came to double or to twin the columns of the east facade of the Louvre. And I'm giving the example of, yes, there is that distance between columns, but if you go too far, the column itself needs to split. So there you go. There's a gap between, and there's a gap in the elements. Actually, sort of, there's a limit to the range of transformations that each element can undergo. So the classicals actually, it is in itself isomorphic that these things can expand elastically, but then they break. There's thresholds. So the doubling of the column is really a beautiful invention. There's more people that have used the double column, and obviously also before Claude Perrault, but never in such a aligned version. There was always more a constructive application. So this is where I stop. I'm not going to say anything about the second lecture. That will take even longer than this as an introduction. I do think it's important now because the eurhythmia in English bridges to what Hayri will be saying. Hayri Dortdivanlioglu. Yeah, sorry. It's even worse than my name, Hayri. He will be speaking about Vitruvius and specifically these issues. Hayri is doing his PhD at Georgia Tech. He's also teaching design studios and teaches scripting courses at Georgia Tech. He's also doing, with Marie-Isabelle, he's doing the divergence conferences. So they're very, very active at Georgia Tech, and they sort of created a whole space of their own over there, which is very interesting. You don't see that very often at Georgia Tech. And it's also part of what we are doing over here, because I got a lot of help from them. So there's a lot of background here, so to speak. So what I'm doing now is handing the talk over to Hayri, and he will be, again, like Pablo and Sabri before him, he will be speaking for about 15 minutes about his research on Vitruvius. You can share, Hayri.
Thank you, Lars. Let me share my screen. Okay.
You allowed to share?
Yes. So now you must be able to see my presentation. Awesome. All right. Thank you, Lars. So yes, today I will talk about Vitruvius, his theory, and also his principles, focusing on the interplay between different concepts. So Vitruvius grants his treatise, the architecture, on 3 main frameworks. These frameworks are interwoven into his entire architectural theory. The first framework is his definition of architecture. He starts with this definition in the very first chapter of the first book, and he says that the knowledge of the architect, which is equipped with many branches of study and very varied kinds of learning, is one from Fabrica and Ratiocinatio. And the second framework is his design principles. He lists them as ordinatio, dispositio, eurhythmia, symmetria, decor, and distributio. And lastly, the third framework is his famous tria, Firmitas, Utilitas, and Venistas that we are all familiar with. Despite the brief content of these chapters, they have become the most heavily studied passages of the Architectura due to the textual, semantic, and semantic problems of the abstract concepts, which are no longer prevailing in the architecture discourse, actually. So the initial question for us becomes, what is the purpose of these principles and how do they work? So despite the numerous translations of the Architectura that we see some of the translations of the principles on the screen now, Vitruvius's theoretical concepts have remained enigmatic to the modern readers. He compiles most of his concepts from other arts and disciplines, including rhetoric, music, sculpting, and painting. While Vitruvius becomes one of the rare sources that we can learn about these concepts, his text has been heavily criticized in its language and textual structure. Several scholars have pointed out the ambiguities, redundancies, and the gaps in his text as a disadvantage to understanding his theory. In contrast, I see these qualities of Vitruvian text as a richness that allows us to produce alternative readings of his theory and also keeps him relevant to architecture in any period. Fabricam ratiocinatio, under which Vitruvius's design principles perform the foundational framework. Understanding the role of Fabricam ratiocinatio in an architect's work is a key to unfold the body of Vitruvian theory. They are mostly seen as two contrasting concepts translated as practice and theory. However, rather than a dichotomy, Vitruvian Fabricam ratiocinatio form a supplementary relationship. Vitruvius argues that an architect should embody both Fabrica and ratiocinatio in order to gain authority, which is another very important concept for him, actually. The Latin noun fabrica as a term emerged within craft practices conveys the action of making, building, and constructing skillfully. It is connected to Greek techne through textiles root of Latin tex, meaning weaving, building, fabricating, and joining and fashioning. On the other hand, ratiocinatio, which is originally a rhetorical concept, actually, conveys reasoning, counting, and reckoning in meaning. Ratiocinatio's root ratio corresponds to Greek logos, which means thought or principle, but it also means speech or word. It comes from the root leg, meaning to collect or to gather as weaving words into a speech or in a text. Fabricam ratiocinatio define procedural actions like weaving, counting, and interlacing threads according to a pattern. They are embedded into making through thinking and thinking through making. Vitruvian principles operate within this procedural space. Within this space, they form a dynamic network in which they move around and change their interactions with each other constantly. The ambiguities, redundancies, and the gaps that we mentioned in Vitruvian theory allow these moves and changes in their relationship. Vitruvian principles form a fabric of fabric. There's a network of terms that he uses to define his principles. For example, membrorum, compositionibus, proportionis, effectus, and aspectus are some of the words that Vitruvius draws into his definitions. And more importantly, he also refers back and forth to certain principles to define each other. For example, he refers to symmetria in the definitions of ordinatio and eurhythmia, even before explaining what symmetria is. This shows that principles are linked to each other in a network, and they move around to define their relationships with one another. Here I will focus on only 4 of these principles and analyze their relationships, starting with the first one, ordinatio. Vitruvius defines ordinatio as adjustments of parts and to the whole with the agreement of proportion to a symmetrical result. Not only in ordinatio, but also in other principles, including dispositio, symmetria, eurhythmia, Vitruvius emphasizes the composition of members and their relationships to other members and to the whole. In these definitions, there is an ontological question. How do parts exist? Can they exist by themselves? And how do they interact with each other and with the whole? Vitruvius sees parts as members, like limbs of a body. Members are defined by their internal measures, such as width, length, and height, and also by their external measures, such as distances between each other and their positions. And the internal and external measures are interrelated. They check out each other in design. For example, as Vitruvius describes, there is a proportional relationship between the diameter and the height of an ionic column, and an arithmetic relationship between internal measures and external measures of columns. The change in proportions of a column would cause an alteration of spacing and vice versa. Therefore, the members are pliant and changeable until all the internal and external measures are fixed. So the question now is, how do these principles control the pliancy of members, and how do they fix them into a single form? Ordinatio provides an abstract structure, allowing members to change and move around in harmony. It's a spatial and a textile concept. Vitruvius mentions taxis in Greek as the equivalent of the Latin term ordinatio. In Old Greek, taxis is a military term defining not only the ranking between soldiers, but also their physical ordered position in a formation. Similarly, Democritus uses taxis to define the ordered positioning of atoms. Moreover, if I need to add ordo, from which ordinatio derives, literally means rows of vertical tracks in a loom. Latin ordior means to begin weaving, to lay the warps in a loom. Ordinatio then provides a structure to the design, operating very much like a vertical spring. As in weaving, the rows of threads give the abstract and physical structure to a loom, and the interlacing members will make the pattern of fabric appear on the screen. Now we came to the second principle. There is no Latin word equivalent to symmetria, and the modern word symmetry has a very different meaning than the symmetria in Old Greek. As a compound word composed of syn and metron, symmetria literally means common measure in Greek. Vitruvius mentions symmetria in his definition of ordinatio as the principle that checks the agreement between the members of the work itself and the relation between the different parts and the whole in general. He illustrates this agreement between members in the human body, which has a kind of symmetrical harmony between forearm, foot, palm, finger, and other parts of the body. His definition of symmetrical agreement between body parts and between the body becomes a canonical model for proportions in Italian Renaissance. However, despite the highly ordered and symmetrical arrangement of the Vitruvian body, it does not represent a fixed ratio. As McEwan argues, it is a formula of relationships rather than a canonical equation. Like in the Vitruvian body, ordinatio and symmetria in an architectural work do not produce a canon or a fixed arrangement. They provide a formula that actively checks internal and external measures. Vitruvius' dispositio is mainly responsible from external measures of members. He gives the term diathesis as the Greek equivalent of the Latin term. Both terms imply putting in place, positioning, and arrangement through position. The members are pilioned and moving around until they are put in their place and become fixed. This fitting in a place fixes the form of the members. Vitruvius defines dispositio according to quality, in Latin qualitate, coming from Greek word poiotes. In Stoic ontology, actually, poiotes makes an unidentifiable matter a specific object. In another word, it gives form and identity to a formless matter. Therefore, dispositio fixes the form of the members by fitting them in their places. However, how does this fitting work? What moves principle back and forth between pilioned and fixed states during design? Eurythmia answered these questions, bridging between pilioned and fixed forms and checking the harmony between internal and external measures. The Greek word eurhythmia is composed of eu and rhythmos, literally meaning well-formed. For Vitruvius, eurhythmia is beauty and fitness in the adjustment of the members, corresponding to a symmetrical arrangement. Being fit is a significant notion for eurythmia. As Lars mentioned, in a conversation with Socrates, a blacksmith called Pistias uses eurythmia to define his armors as well-formed because they fit well to the warrior's body. However, this fitness is not an exact match between the form of the armor and the form of the body, but it's more of a loose fit that allows the warrior to move. This moving body defines the fitted form of the armor. So rhythmos, which eurythmia comes from, refers to a form as in an instance of a body in movement. Patterson defines rhythmos as an unmoving form created by movement. Pollitt points out that the form rhythmos of a sculpture is produced in rest. In conclusion, rhythmos refers to a composition formed during the index of a movement, just like the Vitruvian man resting by laying on the floor. The loose fit in eurythmia allows members to move back and forth between pilioned and resting stages. Any changes in the internal or the external measure mobilizes the members of the resting composition. So I would like to end my presentation with this frontispiece from Galliani's 1758 edition of Vitruvius. I do imagine this playful etching, full of movement and interaction between figures, somehow illustrates the dynamic interplay among the Vitruvian principles. So that's pretty much it from me. Let me stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Hayri.
Thank you.
I would like to ask the chorus if you guys have any remarks.
Hi. Am I
Yes, we can hear you.
am I loud and clear?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, and I like your interpretation of Vitruvius very much because it does not address the canonic um, issue. Which is very much addressed in the period I studied around Piranesi, the canonic Vitruvius, the proportions that we have to follow, the order of the columns. So I think it's very interesting. Yeah, thank you for that. And what a relief to address the overflowing of concepts. Now, maybe I have a question why you only address the first four. Maybe it has to do with the fact that the last two are sort of implied already in them. But I was interested in the fact that decor is translated in Greek by Vitruvius himself, I believe, to prepon. Which I then looked up, and I saw that in Homer's time, prepon was not so much the appropriateness or the fitting, but standing out and to distinguish yourself as in a battle, the shining aspect, you could say. So it is not the later use of it as appropriateness. I made a note of this. Well, there was another word, appropriate, well, the decor as convention, I would say. But it was more about prepon as standing out. And so, yeah, I would like to have your opinion whether discussing the first four principles already implies this prepon or this decor and the venustas that it sort of anticipates.
Yes, thank you very much. So it's a very loaded question. So let me unpack one by one. That's great. So yes, the decor and distributio, they are somehow embedded in the first four principles. I see them, those two, decor and distributio, like when we are talking about spacing of the columns, Vitruvius use distributione quite a lot to describe the distribution of the columns. So it's not only a compositional concept, but it's also a material concept, because then we are starting to talk about what type of material the columns are made, can we afford that material? So the more ethical and material questions are coming into the discussion when we include the decor and distributio into. I couldn't have enough time to cover all these complex relationships. That's one of the reasons why we limited it with the first four principles, because they are somehow very much fitted into each other. And it actually brings us to the discussion of the prepon in Greek, because I believe it's Cicero who used prepon as the Greek translation of the decor, or decorum as he uses. Vitruvius uses decor, Cicero uses decorum. They are almost the same. And it has two meanings used by Homer. One is fitting into each other, fitting in, like the members of the ship, they are fitting in so well so it wouldn't leak the water inside the ship. He uses the prepon to describe it. And the other concept is, of course, standing out, and also making it appear. I believe it's very much related with the idea of cosmos and the techne, because the techne itself makes things appear and gives identity to the things, right? So, and if we think about the techne, it's mainly about bringing things together and fitting them into their right places. So there must be this like cyclic relationship between prepon, techne, fitting and standing out.
Well, thank you very much, Hayri. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I'm interested in the fact that it's intermingling and shifting, and well, a cycle as well. Yeah, thank you.
Cool. I have a question about, there seems to be two things that are like, I see this horizontal Vitruvian man, because we should really sort of get rid of the idea that he's standing. This is really the Renaissance idea of the Vitruvian man. He's lying horizontally on the ground, and then there's your vertical loom. So I'm like, and there's I'm wondering what that is, because the loom is this sort of a rhythmic machine. It has a certain spaces of spacing of the threads of the was it the warp or the weft?
Warp. Yeah.
Okay, the warp. So we get a sense of meter there. We get this sort of setting of the rhythm, almost like a percussive instrument. And so you have the drums starting, and then you need to sort of you have to bring in your elements. And these are elastic, like any other thread. So it is a very textile concept of techne, right? How you actually bring in, and there is the rhythmos, there's the rhythm coming in, and I'm thinking of this loom as a design machine, and I'm sort of trying to forget this horizontal figure at the end. What I'm trying to understand is like, there is this internal proportionality of the elements, and then there's this external measure, and these sort of check each other. Mm-hmm. So there's this sense of movement and rhythm, and it must be very difficult to construct a proper theory, almost like when you're writing and not scripting, like on a computer screen. Because that would be quite interesting to do, to actually see that rhythm, and then to actually sort of understand what he means with the Vitruvian man. Because I'm wondering, it's like, why is that Vitruvian man there? Because the Vitruvian man is lying there. All the proportions are set. It's a man that is in his middle age, probably. So he's not a baby, he's not an adolescent, he's not an elderly. So he has very specific proportions related to the type of movements he does. And now he's deprived of movement. He's lying there on the ground, while the loom is this movement machine. And I'm thinking, like, how do these then come together? And what is then the status of that final object between these two poles?
Yeah, thank you, Lars. So, yeah, no, that's very helpful. Yes, definitely we can define that warp, the roles of warp, the screen as the design machine that gives rhythm. But I believe there are multiple rhythms happening at the same time. Mm-hmm. Like, as an example, when we are talking about, in a classical architecture, when we are talking about the temple, and there are different rhythms of different parts. For example, when we are talking about the rhythm of the columns, they not necessarily correspond to the rhythm of metopes, right? So there's actually quite a problem with the rhythm of the metope at the corner, because it doesn't fit, or it requires additional spacing, right? So there needs to be a change in the rhythm. So there are like these polyrhythm happening at the same time, and this Vitruvian machine or the loom is trying to control all those different rhythms simultaneously. So there's this move between different rhythms and different members and fitting them into their places. So there's an interplay of the rhythm as well. The Vitruvian man himself is, I think, the issue with the Vitruvian man is the Renaissance construction, because they are really obsessed with the mathematics, and they needed to fix the man. And when we read Vitruvius, actually, we don't know what he is doing. because he doesn't give us a description of what Vitruvian man is doing. We don't know if he's laying down or he's jumping or he's walking, but he gives just the formula of what are the proportions, what are the ratios between members. So then he says that he can fit into the square and the circle. So those are just some instances. So and the rhythmos actually exemplifies it better in my head, that I'm just imagining Vitruvian man is actually doing jumping jack. So lifting his arm, jumping, and then lowering his arm, bringing his legs together. And we are seeing those as instances of the Vitruvian man that fits into square, that fits into the circle. So the man is active, he's in motion, but then we see that instance of placement. So that's when the Vitruvian man fixes its proportions, fixes its form into a whole, into a different geometry, right? So, however, Vitruvian man is still active, it's still moving. So very much like in this loom, all these principles are still active, checking each other, even though the members are fixed into one place. And that's this loose fit, this looseness allows those members to move back again, change its form, change its relation between different members, different columns, or the columns and metope, just to find a different rhythm together.
Thank you.
So there's a lot of movement and a lot of different rhythms playing, interplaying.
That would need some serious diagramming. If you really sort of want to make that argument of the polyrhythmic. I think that's very interesting. I don't think that's ever been made. This rhythmal schema problem is unresolved, thank goodness. Is there anything we can say about how Venustas plays a role here? Because that's sort of, it's clear what Fermitas is. It's quite clear what Utilitas is, even from our viewpoint. But the Venustas always translated as beauty. But we know it's a translation of grace next to gratia in Latin. So it's quite direct. That we know that from rhetoric as well. That's a translation of charis. Can you say something about that? He's probably the only architect ever speaking of grace,
Yes, and I think the confusion also comes from that double translation of Venustas. We usually hear Venustas as beauty rather than grace, but there are some translators like Granger and others uses grace as the translation of Venustas. And I feel like that's more correct translation because, first of all, Venustas very much related with, as you said, charis, which is related with the grata and grace in Greek and then the Latin. So the issue about the eurythmia, rhythmos, schema, and Venustas, Vitruvian mentions all these concepts at different points, and sometimes he mentions them interchangeably, he uses figura, schema together, and we know that schema is more like a fixed form. And when it's the fixed form, it's very much, it's more about the beauty rather than the grace for Vitruvius. So, and then he uses, for example, elegant effect of the members. Mm-hmm. That elegancy is very much related with the grace and the rhythmos. So I really need to work on that, as you said, the diagramming of these concepts as well when it comes to the Venustas, because I feel like there are some double play of Venustas as beauty and Venustas as grace, depending on Vitruvian definitions.
Anybody else? Hi, Sunil.
May be just another remark, if I may?
Oh, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Sunil. Yes, Sunil, go ahead.
No. Please go ahead. I'll come in a moment.
Sure. All right. Just a remark on the theory and practice, and I like very much that you said they are complementary, supplementary. I think you said fabricatio or fabrica and ratio cognitio, because. And I'm going back to my fascination with Piranesi. Piranesi himself, although he attacks Vitruvianism as a canonic teaching, he does point out that in his time, in the buildings, so in the building practice, there were lots of exceptions to the rule and variations, and especially in proportions and in the relation of parts to whole and of ornament to structure. So this complementary or supplementary relation of theory and practice must have been an issue in Vitruvius' time as well. Would you say that Vitruvius, he was serving to Emperor Augustus, it's the beginning of the empire, wanted to establish a rule or wanted to emancipate architectural practice?
Yeah, sure. So the first part, we know that there's a communication between Prenese and Galliani in the 18th century. Actually, Prenese sent some etching to Galliani and asked him to send his translation of Vitruvius to himself. So we know that actually Prenese read Galliani's translation of Vitruvius. And if we look at Galliani, there's a very strong Aristotelian influence in Galliani's translation of Vitruvius. So, and in Aristotelian thought, of course, there is this differentiation between the ergon and the knowledge, and then the episteme and the techne. So there's a very clear-cut definition where the practice belongs and where the theory belongs, right, in Aristotle. So for Vitruvius, he is very much influenced by these sources and also the Stoicism. And I think his practical background somehow overweights in this equation, because when he starts writing about architecture, he wants to establish himself as a person who has the highest quality of the knowledge, right? So, but he doesn't also want to disqualify his practical background. So he brings those theory and the practice together and embed them. He says that, like, actually, when a person mastered the both practice and the theory, it's more like an armed man. So he also refers back to the military and being armed in a fight with the practice and theory together. I guess it's somehow like a strategical tool just to show himself or elevate his status to a level of the theory production, not only the practice of architecture.
Okay. Sunil, let's go to you.
Oh, it's very nice to meet you all. I'm not sure I've got a particular question, or because I'm sort of also getting my headspace into where you all are at in a way, which is really, but it's been really lovely to hear the conversation so far, and it's obviously very rich. Harry, I'm kind of, I don't know if it's appropriate for me to ask this question, because in a way you're a group that you perhaps do know this more, but I'm slightly interested to know what sort of led you into this work. And the reason I ask that is also then to understand where you perhaps want to take it, because I think sometimes when we engage in these topics around things like these terms such as grace and rhythm and so forth, that we can get quite drawn into kind of ontological, sort of what is it? But I think there's also a sense of what are we going to do with it? And you did hint one of your answers about a certain ethical dimension. I think that's certainly where I found myself taking all of this, to sort of ask questions of how do we want to be rhythmical? And I mean, given today's circumstances, literally, it's kind of there's a very serious question of that. But no, so I'm maybe, so yeah, I know it's a bit of a big question, but I'm slightly interested to know what's drawn you into this particular study as a way of then suggesting how you might develop out how others might take this on, or you might take this on, and where it, what it opens up and so forth. Perhaps I don't know if that's too broad a question, but I'd be interested to hear you talk about that.
Yeah, definitely. So actually, there's not a moment that I can pinpoint that like this is the time that I drawn into this topic, because it's more like a journey. I started with Vitruvius as like, this very well-known figure, very well-known theory. I have like multiple translations of Vitruvius, so it seemed like everything is resolved and we know him. But then when I get into actually somehow critiquing architecture through Vitruvius, I saw that there's all these gaps in his theory, which we think that it's all filled and everything is fixed. And then the more I analyzed and I read Vitruvius and his sources, actually, then I realized that there's all these gaps and ambiguities where I can actually find my own alternative reading of Vitruvius as against to this canonical understanding or whatever that or Renaissance construction of Vitruvius. So that's how it brought me to principles and the interplay between the principles, and then through rhythm and grace. So it's more like a journey rather than I was interested in this specific topic. That's why I picked Vitruvius and then analyze it through rhythm and then the principles.
Okay, I'm still kind of maybe interested to then know what you think then's coming out of this, and how, I mean, and not just as a sort of history and a kind of a rereading of Vitruvius, but how you might then start to apply this in other ways, or other people might pick this work up. I'd be interested. I also have one other observation. When you talk about a network of terms, I was slightly uneasy with that, in that I think particularly the arrows. I'm always a little bit unsettled by arrows, because they say a lot more than perhaps they should. And but I'm wondering also if there is something in your project around the network of terminology and this sort of reaching that goes on. We're trying to find these terms. We're trying to settle on something. And I thought that was really, really interesting. Although that particular diagram of, I was thinking, what?
Yeah,
There's quite a lot of intervention there. But anyway, go on. Sorry, I'll let you speak.
no, sure. So actually, let me share my screen again. So that specific diagram comes from Fisher's recent book. He also very much interested in the entanglement of the principles. So that's why I do believe all these, he represents them with arrows to figure out that entangled quality between the principles. However, I think my view of the principles, the concepts, and their network is more like this. This is my work illustration. So when we start this, somehow looking at each concept and how they repeat themselves within the definitions and how they are interrelated, rather than those arrows, it creates a network, as you see in the screen. And I don't know if you can see, but there are there are different levels of networks as well, represented, some of them with the thicker track, some of them with thinners, and then gray, black. So it's really more a network, not an arrow, but it's a situation of these concepts moving in the theory to make each other exist somehow. I hope this would be helpful.
Yeah, I'm just thinking like what is a network here, because a network is made up of nodes, and we see a lot of crossings, and these crossings, some of the threads that are crossing are not properly networking, so you would have to think about what are actually the nodes and what are accidental crossings. We got a lot of, especially in architecture, we got a lot of abuse of the word entanglement. You know, it's actually a word from quantum mechanics, you know, that you cannot separate the viewer from the object. We are entangled, you know, and that is something very different than looking at a network that is entangled. So that, yes, obviously there's an entanglement of nodes. But networks are like, they have proper dimensions and structures, and I mean, we know that for a long time already. You can actually sort of calculate the dimensions of networks, look at the amount of lines that come out of nodes and how they crisscross. So that it's very often a metaphor for something that's complex, but that's not really the same thing. So we have to be really careful. I think your loom is more precise. You're saying, well, you know, and it has a proper a Greek understanding, the power of the loom in the oikos, in the house. You know, there's a lot of what we can say about, you know, this, and it's also related to decor. I mean, Gijs Wallace mentioned this already. There's a whole power of this notion of poikile in Greek philosophy. That means the variegated cloth or mantle, or so there's this what comes out of the loom as a sense of costume and custom is a very powerful idea, and I think it does help us to think about this standing out. I think because we often think about dress code as something that fits in, that is appropriate. I mean. Now, what you wear to a funeral, to a marriage, or to a party, that's very different. But here there's a specific standing out, and that's also about color. I'm not sure what Vitruvius actually says about color, but we know from Greek architecture how colorful it actually is. You know, the stoa was extremely painted, was poikile. So yeah, there's a lot of references there. On that level, I think that are closer to Fabrica than that of a network in the sense of let's say Latour, or you know, that's.
It could be useful to use words such as nets and meshes, and I mean I don't know if you're familiar with Julien's writings on sort of divergence and living, that he refers to the idea of the net. As, you know, if we imagine when we catch a fish in a net, it shapes to the fish, and I think there's a sort of recursivity that perhaps is worth considering in some of the diagram that you're doing. Because that you start to then think about the shape of that rather than being that flat sort of map, in a sense that there's and it's interesting you used the word journey earlier. You're on a personal journey, and I mean we all are with these research projects, but in some ways there's a sort of mapping, there's an itinerary that's on that diagram, but actually perhaps the itineraries will shape and they will reshape and perhaps even change the fact whether you can go back another way or not. Which I think gets you to things like rhythmos, because you're getting, as you know, as has been said, it's a kind of, it's sort of time in form. It's a rhythm of form, and one form is going to determine another, really. So it might be interesting to do. It's kind of a slightly crazy diagram now, but yeah, really interesting.
Okay. Okay, what I need to, because we're going to a map now, we do need some time to look at our fabulous figures. we are expanding the map. I'm not sure if you saw that already, Sunil, but we are like working on a map made of figures that each contain like quotes from readings as well as images. There we go. This is a collective board called Miro. It's a piece of software often used in architecture to do online
I have used
presentation.
Miro. Yeah, it's a very lovely tool.
Yes. So we got Aglaya in the middle, then there's certain figures coming out, her relationship to Hephaestus the dwarf, where he's not actually a dwarf, he's club-footed. So we've been working a lot on the left side and the bottom of that diagram. We're going to the right side of the diagram, which is really the Hephaestus side of the makers. So we planned like a number of presentations, like 5 presentations of 5 different figures. The first one is an extension of the dwarf and the forger that were related already very early on in the seminar. And then we will go to the Jackhammer, which is an extreme version of rhythm. We will go to the Flea-Flicker and then to the Transducer, the jumper from high level. So we're on the right side of the diagram. Then we fly downward underneath Aglaya again, and we get to the Cosmic Dancer. So that's sort of the program for the next few. Well, I would almost say few hours. Anyway, let's start with the first one. It's done by Hayden. We got a text of Homer in the middle, who describes, Homer is describing Hephaestus coming from his anvil, and with his. This is the translation of Samuel Butler, actually, from the 1870s of the Iliad, the famous 18th book. Where the monster is hobbling off his anvil and his legs plying lustily under him. So what you see here is a description of the ply-footed, the club-footed Hephaestus in his forge. So we already like developed the forge and the dwarf on the left side, and now we're going to, let's say, the Norse interpretation of the mythological interpretation of the dwarf as a smith god. So the first will be speaking is Hayden.
All right. Yep. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
All right. All right. So thank you, Lars. As Lars said, we began with 2 events ago. We had our figures of the forger and the dwarf being a version of the forger. And as Lars said, we have the tie into Hephaestus, and I will multiple parts of that tie into multiple parts of the Norse mythology, as I like to say. I started with one of our prescribed readings and then fell into a rabbit hole of Norse mythology. And so the reading I began with was Eliad's The Forge and the Crucible. And the quote there is, according to Snorri, Odin and his priests were called forgers of song. And the particular forger of song there is Bragi. He is the god of music. He's the god of all music and the god of all poetry. And the Prose Edda, which is one of the 2 major source texts of Norse mythology, says that the gods themselves dwelt in Asgard. Some of them were of the mighty Asa race, and so Asa is a god. Valfather Odin and Frigg, his queen, Thor, the master of Mjolnir, this will come in later, Baldur, and the good one-handed Tyr, and then Bragi is the songsmith. And so already they're developing a notion that songs are something that is smithed or forged. And then through this, there are many different things. I'll try to go quickly here. But in the Celtic and Scandinavian religions by McCullough, it talks about how poetry became the dwarf's drink because of the forging of all the forging of songs, and dwarves were the forgers of Norse mythology. also tying back into Hephaestus. So we move into this pair of dwarves here that you see centered in the screen. They are Brok and Sindri. And so in this, the quote right above the middle image, I'll read that real quick, is, "Then Brok gave Thor the hammer and said he would be able to strike as heavily as he liked and whatever he targeted, and the hammer would not fail, and he threw it at something. And if he threw it at something, it would never miss and never fly so far that it wouldn't find its way back to his hand." And it mentions here that there is a flaw in the hammer, which is strange. This hammer is Mjolnir, of course, that is Thor's hammer. This is the most powerful weapon ever created in Norse mythology. But the hammer was rather short, and we have the origin story of why the hammer is short. And it was actually the third of three gifts that this duo of dwarves created. The god of mischief, Loki, challenged them to create something superior to some of the other famous forging dwarves. And so they began, I won't read this full text here, but they began by casting or forging in gold to create a gift. And Loki transformed himself into a fly and bit one of them. And so the dwarf then pulled his creation out of the fire, and it was a living boar with golden hair. And this golden bristled boar gave off light and could turn the night into day and run faster than any known horse through the air and the water. And after this initial failed gift, Sindri tried to create another gift out of gold, and the fly, being Loki, bit Brok's neck, and Sindri drew out the magnificent ring that was intended to be this perfect gift here, but it also failed in the sense that at every ninth night, 8 new golden rings fell out of it at equal weight, and this was not the intention, though it did prove of great use to the gods later on. And then finally, after 2 failed golden gifts, they tried again with iron. And with the iron, Sindri produced a hammer that is unsurpassed in quality, which never missed its mark and would become a boomerang back to its owner after being thrown. It had one flaw, and the handle was short. Sindri lamented that he had almost ruined the piece, which was called Mjolnir, for lightning. And nevertheless, sure of the great worth of their 3 treasures, Sindri and Brok made their way back to Asgard to claim the wages that were due to them. This is because Loki had wagered his own head that they could not produce something superior to to the weapons that had already been created by other forgers. And then I'll go back to into the Poetic Edda, which is one of the other source texts of Norse mythology. This is above. Sorry, my computer's fussing at me. Which is above the dwarf text. And it talks about how the gods use these various a ring dispensing gold and a brass shod steel, which or brass shod steed, which all of these are forged things. And then there's a men's weapons song, which is songs about the things that are forged, and the forgers themselves actually sing while they are forging. And here we have the forger dwarf Volund, who I don't know, Hayri, if you can play the video and have sound go on. But this is a reading in the Old Norse. Is it coming through?
Konung is with you. Hann átti tvo sonu og eina dóttur. Hún heit Báðubildr. Bræður varu þrír, synir finna konungs. Einn slagfeður, annar Egil, þriði Valundr. Þeir skriðu og veiddu dýr. Þeir komu í Úldal og gerðu sér þar hús. Þar vatn heitir Úlfsjar. Morgun fundu þeir á vatnsstrandu konur þrjár og spunnu lím. Þar.
Yeah, thank you. And so that gives you an idea of sort of the meter that begins. And this is a song or a poem, because in this time, song and poetry were the same. And this is an excerpt from the Poetic Edda of Volundrakvida, which is the story of Volund, who is this forger dwarf who has had his weapons stolen from him, and he has been enslaved to serve another king. And so he sings in his anger as he forges, and he says, "He sat and never slept, and his hammer plied, but much more speedily with vengeance devised on Nidud." And Nidud is the god that has enslaved him. But as the hammering and the rhythm of the hammer increase, I think that leads us well into the Jackhammer, which is not my text, so I shall hand that back over.
You ready, Sabri? Yeah.
Yeah. Is it my turn? Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to talk about the Jackhammer. I basically did a presentation on the torso limb index in the previous event, and I wanted to extend it with this figure where we looked at the notion of jumping in dive, and particularly in the Olympic dives, and it also has some kinship to the seal and the crab that I investigated in my presentation too. But my presentation actually starts with this quote from Eugen Pedersen on Rhythmos, basically where he says, "Sucht die Bedeutung einer unbewegten Gestalt, die durch Bewegung entstand," which basically translates to an unmoving figure created by movement. And I wanted to understand this notion of rhythmos in the dive jumps, and there's in the bottom left here, you're actually looking at 3 different positions that are used in dives, which is called tuck, pike, and layout. And this immediately draws some relationship of the configuration of the body that is also used in Vitruvius and the center of gravity. So in my research, I look at a polar term that I extract on German Romanticism, particularly Goethean morphology, the polar concepts of contraction and expansion, and I was looking at the configuration of the torso limb index in these figures and trying to understand the relationship of angular velocity, moment of inertia, basically how that type of center of gravity relates to the movement of the figure. So moving on to the right, you're actually looking at the extensive diagram of a typical high jump. Basically, we have 4 stages called approach, takeoff, flight, and entry. And basically, on a platform, we are accumulating energy. So there's high torque because we are moving using our limbs. We are running. And that's basically limbs are overpowering the torso. That's what I call as an expansive movement. And at the takeoff, we're actually converting the torque energy that we have accumulated to moment of inertia. So we basically get kind of in a state where we are more torso-oriented, and you can also see the forward-leaning figure is kind of pushing the torso, the chest forward. So that's, I think, more a torso-oriented or a contractive moment in this jump. And moving on to the third part of the sequence to the flight. That's where all the rotation happens. So we get a lot of conversion into high angular momentum. So we get actually low moment of inertia because the limbs actually contract and they become basically control the rotational aspects of the body movement, and that's where you get your tuck and pikes. And that's where we also get limbs overpowering the torso, so it's more of an expansive moment. And in the final dive at the entry, the body is lined up again, so the limbs actually overstretch, and we get this line. So torso dominates, making the figure into alignment, and we get high moment of inertia again. So this type of alteration between expansion and contraction I also found in my research on leaf morphology, and I want to draw some kinship between the sequence of this rhythmos, basically that form movement that we also see in leaf development, because the expansive and contractive cycles, they also reciprocate each other during the development of a leaf, and I try to capture that with certain images here. So you're seeing kind of outward stretching and inner collapsing, kind of mimicking almost the rhythmos that happens in the figure sequence of the jump. And moving down, I further extended this to a polar understanding of the low jump and the high jump. So here we are actually looking at the two figures that I extracted in my presentation called the crab and the seal, because the crab is limb-oriented and the seal is torso-oriented as animals. And we kind of get this contrast happening between the low jump that takes place on the springboard and the high jump that takes place in the platform. So you actually see more pikes being used in high jumps and tucks being used in low jumps. So the low jump is more limb-oriented, the torso is more expanded, but the limbs are contracted. Whereas in the high jump, we actually get more torso orientation. So the torso is contracted and the rotations are more happening on the rotation of the torso as well. And in the final part, I kind of try to make a relationship to the movement of these two heroes that we see in the Marvel universe, the Spider-Man and the Iron Man, because I think the Iron Man represents in its flight motion this type of torso orientation, right? Because the limbs, like there's actually a scene in the first Iron Man when he tries to do his first flight. He doesn't know how to control his limbs, and he actually discovers that if he stands as a line, then he has more stability. So I think he discovers the layout configuration, and that becomes kind of a torso orientation of almost flight. Whereas in Spider-Man, who also uses more limbs with the web, has more kind of a gliding flight, so the arms are more outstretched and it can do swerving motion between the buildings. So I try to like extend this notion of the polar relationship between the torso limb index to the jump, and how that sequence of figures that we also see in rhythmos is replicated in the dives, in the Olympic dives.
I start? Okay, so thank you, Sabri. So the figure of the Flea-Flicker begins with a psychological jump. First, I want to bring your attention to the tarot cards and fortune telling. Tarot has origins in playing cards, which were first invented in China in the 9th century. From there, card games spread across Persia, Egypt, and into Europe. The word tarot actually derives from the Italian tarocchi, a game enjoyed by aristocrats in the 1500s. Tarocchi roughly translate to foolishness, but the etymology itself is uncertain. According to Richelet, the noun taraux will come from the French verb tarauter, to decor. Yes, to decor the back of the cards with points or geometric figures so that the front cannot be guessed by transparency. A term derived from an old device called carrière, which is used to drill holes in the walls. The most factual and common strategy for reading the cards is placing 3 cards which will represent a jump in time, past, present, and future. Also in tarot reading exists the concept of a jumper, which is a card that flies out of the deck during the shuffling process. This random card is not chosen by the querent, but by destiny, or I would better say by an accident or by the shuffler's clumsiness. So it's that first cluster of images you see there. We can see the tarot reader and the querent, and the back and front of an old tarot card, and the 3 cards representing the past, present, and future that I'm driving. But continuing with the concept of card games, I want to make the first jump in the diagram of the Flea-Flicker figure, only this time I want to entertain you with the concept of the bluff done by poker players. Roger Caillois, in his book Men, Play, and Games, quotes, "In games such as poker, it is the qualities of psychological acumen and character that count." A quote by Stephen Connor's book, Philosophy of Sports, "The player who successfully feints manipulates the fact that a sporting movement is powerfully contagious. Those movements, actual or implied, induce corresponding or reciprocal movements which the feinting player himself must anticipate. The art of the feint is to outstrip these anticipations, to mirror one's opponents in their own movements by tempting them to make a move that will be equivalent in its predictability. Hence, perhaps selling a dummy by accepting the challenging pass, taking seriously a possibility that never in fact comes to pass. The player is dummied or wrong-footed. All movements in sport are mimetic compounds of this kind, in which movements are in the process of being transmitted back and forth by contagion and expectation. Jean-Paul Sastre takes the anticipatory movement of a tennis player, which I relate here also to a poker player, as a metaphor for the way in which all human actions can be thought of as projective, always pulled out of self-identity by movement towards a future. Sports involves exertion, a word that is formed from ex, out, and serere, to bind or to entwine. To exert is to put yourself from yourself in such a way as to bind together the two moments of before and after. Card playing and fortune telling became popular, gained traction in the 16th century. Rome, via the work of Caravaggio, in particular his paintings The Fortune Teller and the Card Shops, helped to grow his budding reputation, where we can see these images. The bluffing gesture is sometimes that some of the players are doing, right? The name of the painting on the very right is The Cheat with the Ace of Diamonds by Georges Latour around 1636. Now, the next image is a tree diagram. If you can zoom, yeah, thanks, Hayri. The mathematics of bluffing, and it represents all the possible outcomes of a gameplay. I won't go too deep into it because of time, but it will help to catapult to the next jump of the Flea-Flicker diagram, which is still in sports, but now centering our attention in sport coaches. And I will quote again Stephen Connor's book, A Philosophy of Sports. When coaches map out sporting tactics and movements, their tendency is to break them up into simultaneous but separate actions. As thought, the playing of a game involved the aggregation of a number of independent movements tracks as the assembling of a piece of music may involve the mixing together of different parallel sounds. Lars comments something similar in his book, Grace and Gravity, that the term rhythmos alludes to both form and movement, and especially in the context of conceptualization of foot space as an abstract surface marked with dozens of lines, arrows, and dots. The best example we find not with architects or designers, but with military planners and sport coaches, respectively, drawing the battlefield and the playing field as intricate web of little circles, arrows in different sizes, continuous lines, straights and curved, dash lines, dotted lines, using multiple colors if needed. In the screen, if you can zoom to the left, Harry, there are two American football diagrams and a football soccer chalkboard diagram. The one on the left side is the Flea-Flicker, and at the very top is a short video of this tactic, if you can play it, Harry. Basically, the Flea-Flicker is an orthodox play, often called a trick play in American football, which is designed to fool the defensive team into thinking that a play is a run instead of a pass, which ideally the play will finalize with a touchdown, usually accompanied by a jump at the end, like in this video demonstration. It's a little fast, right? But you will see the slow motion right now. So well, yeah, there you can see it better, I think. So there's like the ball makes like 3 jumps before it goes to the actual runner and connect the touchdown. So the next jump in our figure of the diagram focus on the actual flea jump. There are studies that show that before the flea takes off on a jump, their knees appear to rest on the ground. The knees are in a smooth position during the liftoff, and this is similar to the deception that I was talking about before. I also want to point out the location of the Flea-Flicker figure in relation with the Festus club feet, more archaic link to Dwarf myths, like we were talking right before, which in mythologies all over the world has been associated with both forging and forger. The etymology of the word dwarf, in fact, refers as much as to tiny as to crippleness and deception. So I sort of describe this effortless gymnastic jump that the flea does, and I'm going to quote here Henry Lefebvre's rhythm analysis. Rhythm always, particularly music and in poetry, dance, and gymnastics, always implies a measure. Everywhere there is rhythm, there is measure. The notion of rhythm brings with it or requires some complementary considerations. The implied but different notions of polyrhythmia, eurhythmia, and arrhythmia that Hayri was described today in his presentation. Moving along to our next jump, there is a link between football and theremin player that I would like to point out. Football players are often not just finding or moving into space, but making space for themselves. Games with scrums, like American football, literally creates space of invisibility, black holes in which the normal rules of the game have no force. Players are said to play inside and outside of each other. The space of the field of play is full of pockets, nooks, and alcoves, as well as sudden gaps and clearings. That's why I'm bringing up the theremin. The theremin is an electronic musical instrument invented in 1990 by a Russian physicist named Lev Termen. This instrument is very distinctive not only by the sound it produces, but also by the fact that it is played without direct physical contact between the performer and the instrument itself. There is a gap between the musician and the instrument. Ivan Marinovic, in his research capacitive sensing device in a postural control system, describes the human ability to maintain an upright stance and perform locomotion. In his book, Grace and Gravity, Lars also quotes, a gap is unlike that we call space, and thought it carries a special connotation. It cannot be exactly measured or quantified. The gap enables the appearance of the figure from the perspective of Grace, and space is the space of the object and of things. And there are two projects I want to show you real quick that link play more closely with the idea of jumping and the theremin. I don't know if you can put those two videos where, Harry, well, the first one is called, yeah, that one. The first one is called the theremin trampoline, the athletic musical instrument. Some of the people that try it describe it as a childhood experience that would accelerate their heartbeats from jumping on the trampoline, plus hearing of the spooky sound effects. And the second one is the giant theremin. It was an interactive sculpture 7 meters tall by artist Roman Fox, displayed in 2011 in Melbourne, Australia. And again, you can see the video by the video that people, kids in particularly, loved it. Now, going forward, if you want to scroll or zoom out, Harry, with our diagram, there are two sides of the jump I'm trying to describe you here. One side of the figures who make things jump, Flea-Flickers, and the other side of figures who jump themselves, but in the sphere of humor. Comedians work with distortion, like Mr. Bean with his face and John Cleese with his whole body by the Ministry of Silly Walks. Here is also a short video. Or when you look at the photos of Philip Halsman jump book, we will see how often the jump turns into humor or satire. Right? There is part of Lefebvre's book Rhythmanalysis where he describes people make gestures. They just gesticulate. Legs twitch. Gestures are something made with arms, hands, fingers, the head. Each segment of the body has its rhythm. Another quote from the notion of rhythm in the linguistics expression by Emily Benevist. The notion of rhythm is one of the ideas that affect the large portion of human activity. Perhaps it even serves to distinguish types of human behavior, individual and collective, inasmuch as we are aware of durations and the repetitions that govern them, and also when beyond the human sphere, we project a rhythm into things and events. And to conclude, a quote from Kalois Men Playing Games, there is no doubt that play must be defined as a free and voluntary activity, a source of joy and amusement. Games lead to habits and create reflexes. They cause certain kinds of reactions to be anticipated. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, let's move to the right.
Thank you, Crystal. I am here.
Thank you, sharing?
Crystal. Yes, I'm sharing. Can you see?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. I will actually follow with the Flea-Flicker. I'd like to introduce the figure of the Transducer. And the Transducer is the jumper that was defined for me by a combined, constructed by readings from Lefebvre's rhythm analysis, ideorhythmia, and Mangani's ideorhythmia, and then later on by Roger Calois and Michel Serre. But to begin, in order to construct this figure, I had caught somehow I had caught the description of a prism that Mangani refers to, or that Mangani, in referencing Deleuze and Guattari, referenced with regard to the refrain, and that refrain as a formula that evokes a character or landscape instead of itself constituting a rhythmic character or landscape. It acts upon that which surrounds it, sound or light, extracting from it various vibrations or decompositions, projections or transformations. And when I was reading this, it had some immediate resonance to me in terms of some the concept of transduction as it is defined by Gilbert Simondon. So I just want to briefly just mention how I arrived at the name transducer, in that Simondon regards this operation of transduction as, in fact, an operation that is both physical, sort of multiple operations, really, a bundle of operations that are physical, biological, mental, and social. And in this, actually, I began to build an idea about this transducer, following also some of the elements that you will see. Now, what is particular to Simondon in this regard that I found particularly of note is in his description of the transduction as technicity, as something that begins with a break. And that break is something that we will see as we move forward, a very elemental part of this concept of the transducer. In this case, the break that he is referring to is the break of the magical universe, which is referenced by Marcel Mauss, which is actually this universe rich in potentials that is then split in two. One that on the one side is religiosity, or the ground, and then on the other, the techniques, the specialization of figural function. So both of these have the capacity for evolutionary divergence, but this divergence must find its dynamic equilibrium by a counterforce of convergence, a relational function that maintains a unity. So as you will see, as I sort of discuss this force of divergence and convergence, it began to sort of inform for me some of the figures that I had discovered along the way of this research. Now, before I actually talk about the specific figures, I wanted to point out the structure. So the structure that we're looking at here in terms of quite literally this idea of a ritualized convergence and divergence is described both in Lefebvre and in Mangani as this bundle of rhythms. And this bundle of rhythms, and here quite literally there is a bundle of elements that form a tower. This bundle of rhythms is really what informs a sort of the split, and that bundle of rhythms is actually again informing both a linear a sort of succession as well as a cyclical succession. So at the same time that we have a linear element in this kind of structure of this character, we also have the beginnings of a cyclical or repeating social organization or event. And so this structuring for me was a very important thing, obviously in this kind of linear quality of the laying of the Miro board. But I also think that it was also began to also sort of further emphasize some of these figures that I'm going to show, where the body consists of a bundle of rhythms. And here I quote Lefebvre, different but in tune. It is only in music that one produces perfect harmonies. The body produces a garland of rhythms. One could say a bouquet. What is certain is that harmony often sometimes exists. And then this idea of eurhythmia comes to the fore at this point. The eurhythmic body, which again Hayri has already made reference to, is composed of these diverse rhythms that are happening in a kind of simultaneous setting. So this idea also of regulation and tuning is a very important part of this transduction, or this transductor, who is a jumper, but a jumper that kind of is using his body, but not just his body, his sort of the integration of body and the milieu as a sort of way of providing a measure or a metronome. Again, here in Mangani, we see the concept that he listens, and first to his body, he learns rhythm from it in order consequently to appreciate external rhythms. His body serves him as a metronome. Okay, and rhythm proves to be a moving signifier and an interdisciplinary term. It opens up rather than defines. And so from this idea of this vertical or linear structuring we arrive at the first figure, at the first element that I will introduce you to, which is this, again, the idea of the land diver. And the land diver, allow me to introduce them to you, is a ritual jumper. And this ritual jumper is working in two senses. He is actually, again, there is this exterior quality to the right, as well as an interior quality to the right. For those of you who do not know of these land divers, they exist in the, it's a rite that actually exists currently, contemporaneously in the South Pacific, in Pentecost Island, in the island of the Republic of Vanuatu. And the rite is originally described as having originated from the legend of a woman who died diving off of a tree, dived off of a tree. She did not die. She died off of a tree, escaping from her husband, who was in hot pursuit. Now, tying vines to her ankles, she survived the fall. And this was repeated by the women thereafter in honor of the successful original diver. In an interesting inversion, the men took over the tradition, and replacing the tall trees with the tower that is constructed, the tower that I have shown you here as an initial, in the initial movement through the board, the tower is constructed every year anew. And men dive off of the towers that are constructed. It is uneventful. If it's uneventful, it ensures the success of the yam harvest, and it also establishes itself as the rite of passage from boyhood to manhood. Now, in this case, there is this exterior ritual as well as the interior passage, and here I will show you in this video the beginnings of the rite of the dive. Of the land dive is really occurring from one of the platforms in this tower. The tower is has a series of platforms, and these platforms are at different levels for different levels of jumpers. In other words, different platforms are actually linked to different expertise, levels of expertise. And so what is really interesting in this is that it starts off with a general incantation and a sort of a kind of a public kind of speech. I will run the video here so we can see the beginning of the rite.
Is there any sound?
Can you hear?
No.
Let me try again, see if I can get the volume up. Oh, I don't seem to have a control on the volume here. Well, the important thing to note as we watch this is the fact that the figure starts standing, and so that standing torso, then also the figure as it stands is also preparing himself for the jump, and therefore is actually crossing his arms. So the crossing of the arms and sort of tucking in the extraneous limbs are a very important part of the technique of the jump. Now, and what is also interesting to note is that the in the indigenous language, both the tower and the dive are referred to by the same term, called goal. And the tower is seen as representing the body as well, with its joints, its limbs, and its genitalia. So all of this is actually just a kind of a sort of a repetition or a reprise of the same concept of the body. And the jumpers each have their own jumping off platforms, as I mentioned. And these platforms are also understood as being sort of emblematic of the male genitalia. What is interesting as well is that when the jumper jumps,
whoa,
there is a crack. That crack is actually not the jumper. The crack is actually the struts that are holding up the platform, which are meant to symbolize actually the female. And these struts are always breaking, or they in their break, they buffer the force of the jump. And then, so as you see, I had also the ritual jumper, part of this concept of the jumping. Obviously, I tie this in with the idea of ilinx, or the vertigo, or a game, the vertigo games that Roger Calois has sort of described and discussed in his Man, Play, and Games. And it's part of this kind of passage or transition, is the experience of this this kind of fear and panic, this sense of vertigo. So the last kind of game includes those which are based on the pursuit of vertigo, and which consists of an attempt to momentarily destroy the stability of perception and inflict a kind of voluptuous panic upon an otherwise lucid mind. And so, again, this is actually the passage. Obviously, is not just representative; it is also a physical, physiognomic sort of transformation of the individual as they are experiencing this fall. I will show you again, and then Ceres is also very interesting in this context when he says, Michel Serres, in Variations on the Body, when he says, restored to its best sense, vertigo contributes to the vertical circle, an even easier posture than in the past, as though the turbulent gentleness of the wind-driven rough seas, deliciously oiled, greased, lubricated, anointed the hip, knee, and ankle joints. So we are continually repeating, while improving them, the primitive postures of the anthropoid and the child. And so in the course of this dive, we will see that the diver is actually loops through space and is brought back into circuit by, obviously, into orbit by what I have not mentioned yet, which is actually the vines that are tied to his ankle. Now, these vines are very important because they provide, and we'll look at this further in other examples that I have to show you in this transducer, is the vines are actually elastic, and therefore they are conveying and allowing for a type of movement. They are also very important, kind of part of the cyclical process of this ritual a ceremony, which means that those vines have got to be used from a specific time of year, because otherwise they don't have the necessary elasticity. And in the same way, the very tower can only be built at a specific time of year, because otherwise it becomes too brittle of wood. So in this sense, there is the sense of a jumping that's also an exterior jumping, but there's also an interior jumping, as Lefebvre actually, in this Lefebvre citation, the rhythm analyst, which is what I would consider the transduct taking his own rhythms as a reference by integrating the outside with the inside and vice versa. And so in this idea of vertigo, it is one thing to think it and say it, and the other thing to see it. And so in this video, which I find quite compelling, I will show you, again, the idea of how, now here I will have to move you forward a bit. So we go through the credits a bit and experience I can make it move forward, would be great. Here in the standing position. And so another thing to mention about the very importance of these vines is also how they are constantly calibrated, or they're kind of specifically calibrated to the weight and expertise of the actual specific jumper. So if the vines are too long, then of course disaster results and the harvest will not be good. If the vines are too short, the flip side of that is that the circular motion will not complete its revolution, and the jumper will crash into the tower. And so this is a very specific tuning, again, another example of this tuning, calibration of a number of physical, physiognomic, and mental and psychological elements in this notion of the jumper, of the cyclical and linear kind of a convergence of the transductor. Now, I should also note that here as well, when you fall, the ground itself is also excavated. So on the one hand, we have a tower, and on the other hand, right in front of the tower, there is a sort of a scar that's actually carved out of the earth. Again, the symbolism is pretty obvious, and it is sort of smoothed and made sort of almost like a second birth, a second womb, into which the new renewed individual, be that a recurring adult male who is doing this over, willingly over the years, is sort of allowed to sort of renew or be born again. And in this case, also the young man of 8 and 9 years old can become a man through the passage through this rite. Now, this idea of the jumper, of the transductor, is also actually very important for us. Again, quite literally, the sport of bungee jumping, the idea that we would want to sort of re-engage with this idea of elasticity as opposed to the stiffness of the joints, as you see in the tower, is again articulated by the sport of bungee jumping, which in fact was initiated actually as a research, almost like a research project based on the initial people who had started the bungee jumping were also actually knew about the land divers of Vanuatu and wanted to see how they could sort of give it a contemporary twist. And so in this case, again, there is this idea that in the jump, you're not only jumping, you're jumping from something. So again, it's not just the jumper, it's not just the figure of the jump, it's actually the element from which you jump. In this case, it's typically with a bungee jumping, it's typically a natural formation, a bridge, or some other form of infrastructure, a crane, and the sort of the mechanics of this jump are slightly different because of the way that they're jumping, and that they are basically also, instead of vines, are actually sort of held to the structure by a very, very thick elastic cord. And this very thick elastic, the elasticity of this cord is extremely important as well to the mechanics of this jump, but in a very different sense. In this case, the bungee jumper will launch himself off of and so here again, this cord is incredibly important with regard to really, again, this notion of tuning and calibrating the elasticity of the cord to the weight of the jumper and the length of the cord. So all of these things are actually these multiple rhythms that are actually coming together, being bundled together in this jump, that are of extreme importance, that they actually proceed with a sense of eurhythmia, that they're working together, they're working in concert. So here again, there is a sense, there's less of a ritual from a cultural point of view, but it's actually much more of a ritual as sort of a kind of a contemporary ritual. It's certainly an emphasis on daring, but in this case, again, the very importance of just calibrating how far the jumper can go. Now, the mechanics of the jump are extremely interesting because what happens here is that the repetition, the circularity that we see in Vanuatu, which is actually a yearly cycle that also involves restructuring the structure, in this case happens in the actual jump itself. Because of the elasticity of the cord, the jumper will have the chance to jump once, and then because of the elasticity will continue to move up and down, in other words, oscillate, as long as there is kinetic force in the elasticity of the cord. And so you find, and so very rarely do you see really examples of the jump finishing and, you know, the person going back immediately after. What happens is there is a kind of a reprise, or the chance to actually continually change the posture, change the position, do somersaults, really create almost like an aerial dance that allows for sort of until essentially the cord loses all energy. And so in the elasticity of the cord. And of course, this is actually, again, I don't want to take too much time, but I also wanted to point out there's another example, and this is an example that's pointed out by Roger Callois, which is really about the movement, the jumpers in Mexico that actually jump off of a pole, and they too are tied through vines from their ankles. It's in some ways very similar. In some ways they are really capturing their torso. So I don't want to take up too much time. The other elements that I had here to discuss have to do with, again, another idea of jumping, this idea of polyrhythmia, the way that in this case, the cliff divers in Mexico that actually have to gauge the timing of their jump, the timing of their dive with the ebb and flow of the tide and the waves. Otherwise, certain death will result in the rocks below. And finally, I would like to sort of conclude with the other figure of this transducer that's also a jumper is this notion of the ballooning spider, and the spider that actually, instead of really actually flying in the wind, is actually jumping onto the electrical and wind forces and capturing them through a series of movements. I won't go through them right now, but through a series of movements where he begins to kind of create through his web or warp of strands his own sort of balloon or parachute that allows him to proceed in this kind of jump, which is also a casting off. We're setting sail. And here, Michel's sail is also very important. In the sense of a punctured basket or cask, the body leaks. Our organs sometimes empty themselves of their forms and functions so as to pour them outside. Yes, our limbs cast off, which means they leave us so as to form apparatus tools similar to them, but cast off from them. Thank you, and I'm sorry I took so long.
That's okay. Let's go to the last one. Our cosmic dancer.
Cosmic dancer.
Can you move a bit to the middle, Marie-Isabelle?
Yes.
Yeah. Where's Juzar?
Juzar?
Uh-oh.
You have your his his sound.
Okay, sorry. Okay, the figure I was working was on Nataraja, the cosmic dancer. And I think over here the argument becomes more, the jump becomes more ontological in the sense that the figure jumps from time to space to time to space, or from being to becoming, and in that it acquires a rhythm. Rhythm is about alternation. So there is something, then there is a gap, then there's something, there's a gap, then there's something. So and the figure of Nataraja with the polyrhythmic foot space, of the ghungru. Ghungru is the anklet bells. Many bells, which actually is about the polyrhythmic character of the foot space and the rhythmic hand space. that is of the dumbroo. Even the shape of the dumbroo is actually about the rhythm. Two portions, an hourglass shape. So, and how the figure actually occupies the gap between the hand space and the foot space, the gap between the space and the gap in the time, and how actually it is also about the one and the many, whether it is one figure or are there many figures, because in movement you see many hands, many limbs over there. But when you superimpose one on top of the other on the vertical axis, or the vertical axis of maybe the being, or the vertical axis of death itself, and the horizontal of life and movement, and then you have this figure which actually radiates out, which can be called Wageza or je ne sais quoi, or the way the whole body radiates. And maybe the cosmic dancer is also the figure, the human figure itself, and this whole radiance, or this whole encircling of the figure, or the gap which the figure occupies, is the world of the figure. And then I tried to look at different deities, and these sculptures are in fact almost stroboscopic sculptures, in the sense they are all different movements overlapped on one onto the other. And there were experiments, earlier experiments in motion pictures by Edward Muybridge, and you see the horse figures below, And then what I did was I cut all those figures and actually superimposed on top of the other, and then you have the figure of the horse. And when you see that, it actually talks about the indeterminacy of this whole thing, the indeterminacy of schema and rhythmos, or whether it is moving or whether it is stencil. In that sense, it truly becomes spectral. So some quotes of, if you've similar to words such as train and training, or trace and tracing, we encounter here an ambiguity of movement and form. The sequential temporal order of rhythm can turn into spatial order of form. Temporal, which means one after the other, after one another, and spatial, meaning next to one another. And if both are superimposed on top of each other, and maybe the cycle operates on jerks and jolts, jerks of stoppage, shining, or radiance, and jolts of movement or rhythm, not on continuity. So yes, there is rhythm both as internal movement and as external movement, yet these are not connected by continuity but interrupted by shining stoppages. So in that sense, I think the whole endeavor of these figures with multi-limbed figures was actually I was also thinking about what is actually going on over there. So maybe it is about figure acquiring many limbs when it comes at a poise or a standstill. Yeah, that's it. There's no coherent argument about it, but there are resonances between the figures.
Can you show the ones at the top? Because I can only see the bottom one with the horse. What's that, a monkey?
The top one is of the monkey. I took 5 to 10 images of the monkey jumping, and then I put it on top of each other on the center of gravity, with the hip where the center of gravity is, and then I've and on the left you have again a jumper, a backflip, and then I again superimposed one image on top of the other, and then you have actually the spectral figure, of the jump, and talking about the rhythm, polyrhythmia, and rhythm, and then of course eurhythmia, for this internal form, or being in good form.
Say, Jusa,
that's it.
we're very late already. I would like to ask you a few questions, especially one on Indian theory. Is there any theory on from the side of mythology or anthropology or theology, maybe even? What is the status of a god being multi-limbed?
No, I found a book by Ananda Kumar Swami, The Dance of Shiva, in which there is a chapter on the multi-limbed gods. But over there, he's more critiquing the Western argument about But what he says, the Nataraja image of the primal rhythmic energy underlying all phenomenal appearances and activity, here is perpetual movement, perpetually poised. The rhythm of the spirit, that's what perpetual movement and perpetually poised. Now,
Kamura Swami is typical for the 1910s and 20s. Great theoretician, but of course that's why he speaks about energy. It is so literal, these multi-limbed, and I think I have a sort of brilliant idea to put that like on top of a movement, and then what you call a stroboscopic figure, that we get sort of this this overlap of movement and radiance. I was just wondering if there's any proper thinking in India about what does it mean. They have different attributes in their hands, right?
Yeah. All different. All hands will carry a different thing in it. Maybe a lotus, maybe a knife, maybe this, maybe that, maybe a drum. In Shiva's hand, there is a drum. Drum in the sense there's damru, two-sided thing. This rhythmic thing. In
those
fact,
big radiant on the back, are those wings, or is that also a description of movement? Because they look very sequential. Huh?
Yeah. They are all limbs. In fact, the upper figure of Shitapatra. It's a deity. It's a Tibetan figure, but 1,000 limbs and 1,000 hands, and as if she has just jumped from the heavens to the earth. And then you see whole motion of it. And that's how it actually is. And then Shitapatra translates as a white parasol or white umbrella. This whole umbrella which you see on the left, on the left image, the white parasol or white umbrella of limbs, made completely of limbs actually. And each limb will have a different thing, which also means each limb is performing a different function, a different rhythm. It has its own rhythm to it. And it also talks about the polyrhythmia of the foot space and how the foot space actually goes into and comes out as a figure, and how the hand space again loops back into the foot space. And this whole cosmic dance happens over there. So.
Of all the religions in the world, I think this is the most postural. Of course, we know it from yoga, but also the depiction of the gods being far more postural than what we know from other religions as a sort of variety of bodies. We know, of course, from Greek mythology how they act, but they've never been depicted as such. We, of course, discussed the contrapposto, but these are very, very interesting. I hope we get the chance to study that a bit more. Okay, we have to round this off. I want to thank everybody. It's a pity we can't really discuss the figural contributions, because they start to raise more and more questions. We do plan to have the last event, what would be the event on falling, actually to dedicate that to the Miro board and to have a lot more discussion about the figures and to actually see how the construction and what does it actually mean for the notion of the figure and how they relate to each other. I think it sort of slowly takes over the center of the seminar. I think that's very interesting. It's a real invention. I want to thank Sunil. I want to thank Gijs also for their contributions and questions. We will see each other in 2 weeks again. We will then speak about the hanging figure, the hanging, there's a lot of hanging. Ornament, obviously, but also the figure of ornament, Hephaestus, and puppetry and automata. Because why is Hephaestus doing both things? Why is he creating as much these incredible ornate figures and why does he also create automata, and why are these automata always in gold and in silver? So there's a lot of overlapping again of movement or self-movement with the notion of radiance and embellishment. So the next time we'll have a lot to say about that. We'll see each other again in 2 weeks. Thank you all very much for staying with us. Thank you again.